Good morning or afternoon. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, the Native Plant Project, and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Restoring Shrub-Steppe After Wildfire, Shrub Planting as a Viable Tool in Habitat Rehabilitation, presented by Heidi Newsome with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Before I introduce our speaker, I will go over some webinar details. If you have questions for the speaker or me, please type them into the questions pane of your control panel located at the top right of your screen at any time during the webinar. I will field the questions for the presenter after the presentation, but it helps us if you type questions during the webinar so that we have some ready in the queue. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar presentation, so you're welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio pane and check your audio selections. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Heidi Newsome is the Supervisory Wildlife Biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Mid-Columbia River Refuges Complex in Burbank, Washington. The complex includes 8 refuges and 1 national monument in southeastern Washington and northeastern Oregon. Heidi's major duties at the refuge complex include supervising the biological staff and volunteers, advising managers, conducting wildlife surveys, invasive plant management, and native habitat restoration. Her focus over the past several years has been shrub-steppe ecology and management. Welcome, Heidi, and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay.
All right, I will make you the presenter now. Okay.
Okay. So I think So this is a presentation that
we don't see it yet.
Oh, I have to hit show my screen. Hang on a second. Okay, there we go. Is it showing up for you now?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, great. So this is a presentation that I've given before for the Society for Ecological Restoration, but I did try to make a few modifications for this webinar series, so I hope that it's not repeating for a lot of people. Much of the data that we collected regarding our post-fire rehabilitation was analyzed and produced as a publication just a couple of years ago in the fall of 2013. So if there's any additional information that you want following this presentation, you can definitely get a copy of this paper from Rangeland Ecology and Management, and it has more of the analysis that was conducted on our plantings. So one of the units of the Mid-Columbia River National Wildlife Refuge Complex is the Hanford Reach National Monument, and it's a pretty unique area. It's large, and it's a Department of Energy site that was part of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, and then the lands that became the monument were these buffer lands that were basically since the 1940s, when they created the Hanford site, these buffer lands that were for safety and security were basically untouched. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began managing this area back in 2000. So some of the challenges in the Columbia Basin where the monument is located are that it's in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains, and so it is the hottest and driest part of Washington State. So unlike some of the other areas in the Great Basin or the Snake River Plain, it's a lot lower elevation, and we have a lot of really sandy soils that are from the Missoula floods that took place during the last ice age. So there's some restoration challenges just with regard to the ecological setting, and so that is one of the things that we face. But I feel like if we can do successful projects in this area, that it's a technique that could be used over a wide range of conditions, since this is such a harsh site. One of the other really unique opportunities about having this piece of land be part of the Fish and Wildlife Service managed area is that we have broad goals for the management of the monument, and so they're fairly encompassing of various kinds of work that we could do to manage the resources out there. So the things that were identified in the Monument Proclamation by President Clinton were just the biodiversity of the shrub-steppe ecosystem in this area of the Columbia Basin, and then to protect native plants and animals, so that's pretty broad, and then any state or federally listed species that are considered sensitive. So we have kind of a wide range of things that we could essentially do on this piece of land. So one of the biggest challenges that we've had over the last 15 years are these large-scale wildfires. I created this map. The purple outline is the outline of the monument boundary, and then this shows only the fires that we've had that are over 300 acres, and you can see that a very large footprint of the monument has experienced wildfire in the last 15 years. The big gray block was a fire that took place in 2000, and then you can see the red hatching and the yellow hatching, as well as the yellow block in the southern part of the monument, were all reburned in 2007. So that's a real big challenge when you're talking about trying to restore something like sagebrush that is slow growing in this dry environment and can take a long time to produce habitat for wildlife because of its slow growing nature. So obviously, one of the big changes in response to wildfire is the elimination of shrub cover, and we've shown this is statistically significant. This is from a paper that was done after the 2000 wildfire, basically monitoring some of our shrub species for 4 years post-fire and comparing them to data that was taken from before the fire. We were lucky in some regard in that the monument area had a significant number of studies and ecological plots out there because it was also used as control site for the Hanford science that was done, so there were a lot of vegetation records from pre-fire. Anyway, you can see that, of course, big sagebrush did not recover post-fire on its own. Neither did spiny hop sage. Winterfrat did a little bit of resprouting and regrowing, as did the three-tip sagebrush, but definitely were not recovered to the amount that they were pre-fire after 4 years. So this is a concern for us as wildlife managers because, of course, the shrubs are providing a lot of the structure and cover for various kinds of wildlife on the landscape, and when such a large area is impacted and shrubs removed, it can be a very slow process to restore this aspect of the ecosystem without active management. So from the perspective of Wyoming Big Sagebrush, which is the dominant shrub species in the Columbia Basin area where we're working in the uplands, it's extremely susceptible to fire. It has a short dispersal distance for its seeds, and then the seeds are really short-lived in the seed bank, as most of you know, because they're tiny. So you can see that from the pre-fire data from '94, and then immediately post-fire on the same vegetation transect, you can see the tape in there. You can see the impact of the fire after the 2000 wildfire. And then you can see in 2009, the shrub layer within that transect had not recovered. And so, again, we have the challenge of trying to reintroduce this aspect of the habitat in these areas that are probably not going to have shrubs recover on their own, at least not given maybe centuries, I guess, to to have a root cover on its own. The picture in the top right here is a picture post-fire of an area where we have really good quality native bunch grass. So it's blue bunch wheatgrass with Sandberg's bluegrass in the understory, and a wide swath of the land that we manage was in this condition. And so we're fortunate to have these kind of field sites to select from, where the only major impact of the fire was the shrub cover removal. A lot of these perennial grasses were able to recover from the fire on their own, and so we wanted to try to produce high-quality shrub-steppe habitat with these projects. And again, as wildlife managers, we're concerned with those species that are obligate to sagebrush, including this variety of species, the sage thrasher, sagebrush lizard, sage sparrow, and of course sage grouse that everyone's concerned about, pygmy rabbit, and sagebrush vole. So that's just kind of the reason why we would be concerned about putting sagebrush back within some of these landscapes. So for site selection, like I was just talking about, we picked sites that had native grasses in the understory, in areas that had shrub cover prior to the fire, and we tried to create large blocks so that, number one, logistically it would be a little bit easier for us to install these plants because we wouldn't have to be moving from place to place, but also because large blocks would function better as wildlife habitat as the plants established and grew in these areas. And so the technique that we used was that we collected local sagebrush seed from plants in sites that were unburned, and we collected that in the winter time, in December and January time frame, and used a lot of volunteer assistance to get a large amount of raw seed, and then that seed was cleaned by the nursery so that it could be sowed in a nursery setting. And I don't know if anyone saw the webinar that Clark Fleege gave, but we work with Lucky Peak Nursery. They've really got down a great method for producing sagebrush seedlings, both bare root and container type stock. And we use professional planting crews to install these plants, and we aimed for a density of about 350 plants per acre in these initial projects, and that was about a 10-foot spacing in the landscape. So we used several different kinds of stock, and the analysis that I'll discuss tries to compare and contrast the advantages of using these various techniques. So we used two different sizes of sagebrush tubelings, they're called, which is based on, the size is based on the soil amount that is in the container that the plants are grown in. So there's a 4 cubic inch tubing and a 10 cubic inch tubing that we used. Obviously the 10 cubic inch tubings are larger than the 4 cubic inch. And then we also used bare root plants, which are grown in outdoor nursery setting in an outdoor bed, and that they're harvested out of those beds basically with their roots and their dirt shaken off, and they're packaged like that. And then for some of the bare root plants, we used a hydrogel dip to coat the roots, which is supposed to help maintain the moisture around the roots during the plant establishment phase. We also tried two different types of mycorrhizal inoculant. One was also a dip that you would dip the roots in, and the other was a tablet that you would put into the hole when you're planting the plant. So we had a wide variety of things that we tried over a wide variety of sites, and so it made the analysis a little bit challenging. So between 2001 and 2007, we planted 1.5 million approximately seedling plants across these burned areas. That covered about 5,400 acres, so it was pretty large scale, and I wanted to present this because I feel like a lot of people think plantings can be done at a meaningful scale, but I feel like that it is possible to do plantings of these seedling plants on a scale that can be meaningful for wildlife and habitat. So we set out plots to monitor the survival of the individual plants, and we monitored over 10,000 individual plants from when they got planted, some of them up to 8 years post-planting. So I'll present a little bit about that information. We try to do a little bit longer term. Generally, most of them were monitored for at least 3 years, and some of them monitored into 5 years and even longer. So we had 106 plots and then 12 combinations, like I was saying, of all of those different things that we came up with. So either stock type and what type of amendment it received, given either the hydrogel, the mycorrhizal, or the tablet, and then which year it was planted post-fire. So this is the type of monitoring plot that we used. We set up transects and mapped in the seedling plants right after they were planted, and so all of the plants were considered healthy at the time of planting because we had just received them from the nursery, and we basically used a 100-meter transect as a baseline and tried to make it 10 meters wide. Sometimes we had to make it a little bit wider to try to capture 100 plants. And then we randomly selected the origin for these transects, and we mapped in each individual plant so that you could follow them after planting, and each year post-planting determine if they were surviving or not surviving. So that ended up being 76 transects over 21 sites. And then because we ended up having a lot of different things going on simultaneously across various burned areas, we also implemented a second technique, which was not mapping individual plants. This was 30 plots over 6 sites where they were just 50 by 12 meter belt transects, and the number of live plants were counted. We just compared this to what we had expected to have planted based on density. So these weren't individual survival tracked, but we sort of got an idea of survival just compared to the expected density. So we have data from both of these types of techniques. And here's just sort of a map across burned areas of the different combinations, so all of the confusing combinations. But the big fire in the southern part of the monument on this map was a 2000 fire, and the two in the northern part of the monument were fires that took place in 2005. But you can see that we had both those types of tubulings, the 10-inch and the 4-inch, and then we had the black is bare root, the red is bare root with hydrogel, the yellow is bare root with a mycorrhizal dip, the green is bare root with a mycorrhizal tablet, and the purple is the bare root that had both the hydrogel and the mycorrhizal dip. We combined them in the same tubs when we dipped the plants. So there's quite a combination, but not all of the treatments had the same number of acres, and not all of them were in the same locations throughout the monument, and there were some differences in aspect and slope and soil type. So that is something that may have affected some of the results. And then again, on the other side is the different treatments by the year they were planted from 2000 until 2008. So yellow were the early plantings, red were following that, and then blue, green, purple, and black. Some of the red and blue plots were subsequently burned in the 2007 fire, so we only have a little bit of data from their establishment. So here is a data graph that came from the paper that we produced that compares the stock types, basically the proportion of the planted seedlings that survived to the 3rd year. And one of the things I will say is we had these planted by reforestation crews that are used to planting things like Douglas fir, western hemlock in forestry situations for commercial purposes. So they didn't spend a lot of time planting these plants or making sure they were planted correctly. They just kind of did it in an expedient fashion, and we didn't follow up with watering them or anything, so it was overall a pretty easy project. And in some cases we were getting 35% survival. But when you look across here from left to right, the large container would be the 10-inch tubeling plants that were planted in 2001 based on the average of those. And then the small container plants are the 4-inch tubelings planted in 2001, 2002, and then 2005. And then for the bare root plantings, on the left of that section that says bare root below it, there are some bare roots that had no treatment, which is the blank, some that had the hydrogel treatment, some that had the hydrogel plus the mycorrhizal dip treatment, those with the mycorrhizal dip alone, and then those with the mycorrhizal tablet. So you can kind of get a feel for how the different stock types of these sagebrush seedlings performed. We had the highest survival with the bare root plants that were planted with hydrogel dip in 2002. One of the things that we figured out from looking at precipitation data is that the bare root plants tend to have a higher survival in years where the planting is followed by some decent level of precipitation. They're a little bit more affected by the post-planting amount of precipitation that we receive, whereas the container stocks seem to be a little bit less susceptible to the post-planting conditions, and we were still getting 25 to 35% survival. And it wasn't significantly different between the 4-inch and the 10-inch tubelings, so that to us meant we could probably invest in more plants of the smaller size. And I'll talk about that later. The disadvantage is they're very small when they're put out there on the landscape and take a little bit longer to produce viable habitat for wildlife. So here's another graph. This is from the paper we did, and it's basically showing that in the top graph, the proportion that are healthy in year 1 of the various stock types, high survival in the first year for the 10-inch tubelings and a little bit less for the 4-inch tubelings, but pretty high survival in the first year for the bare root with hydrogel dip, and a little bit less for the, we were curious why the hydrogel with the mycorrhiza actually had lower survival overall than the ones that just had the hydrogel alone. But that was predictive. Their survival in their first year, the establishment year after they were planted, was very predictive of how many would survive to their 3rd year. So you can see in the bottom that there's a strong relationship between those that were considered healthy in their first year post-establishment and to those that actually survived to their 3rd year. And I think that this is just useful for managers to know, because you could do a short-term monitoring in the first year post-planting of seedlings of this type and get a good idea of what your the success of your project would be a couple of years down the road without investing too much in monitoring. And you could also figure out what areas may need to be retreated if you had a bad survival year. And then this is some of the long-term data that I was mentioning before. In the top graph A, this is the 4-inch tubelings that were planted in 2002, and this only includes planted tubulings that were unburned in the second fire. So this is long-term data of those that were in those areas that burned in 2000 and didn't subsequently burn after that. But you can see that after the third year, most of the plants that had established and survived out to the 7th and 8th year. And so in that case, I feel that those plants were then probably providing some decent habitat within those grasslands, providing that shrub cover by year 8. In part B, this is the same small container stock. These were plants that were installed in 2005 and then monitored out to 6 years. And you can see a similar pattern. If they establish within the first year, they're likely to survive out to year 6, or the majority of the plants are. And then for graph C, same thing. If the bare root plants, which it did establish a little bit less overall proportion, but they were able to survive to the 5th year. And the nice thing about the bare root plants is they're generally larger to start out with, and they have a lot more structure in the upper part of the plant. And so by year 5, those are really contributing a lot to the sagebrush cover on the landscape. So one of the other things that we looked at was how many years would it take for these planted seedlings to become reproductive and produce seed that would then be in the seed bank. Another way to think about this is you're creating islands of shrubs within these grasslands, and these islands could then spread out and kind of provide a seed source for future shrubs on the landscape. So we found that even after only 3 years, a large proportion of the surviving plants were flowering and setting seed and producing seed on the ground. So it wasn't well, there was some significant differences in this case, that even though there was a wide variation, as you can see from the the confidence intervals, but the bare root plants with no hydrogel in this case, and the bare root plants with the hydrogel, the bare root minus and the bare root plus, had more structure and more flowering than some of the tubulings. So from a management perspective, this is sort of some of the things that I'll try to sum up that we've thought about in doing a project like this. For the bare root stock that we received, some of the things that I think are the pros or the advantages of using those plants are that they're a larger size initially. They begin flowering and setting seed at a younger age, so sooner than some of the others. And it's easier for the nursery a little bit logistically because of the way that they're grown. You can probably produce a lot more material, a lot more seedlings than you can with the tubuling stock. The container stocks take up more space in the nursery. Some of the disadvantages of using the bare root stock is that the plants aren't very consistent in size, and so that can make them a little more challenging for the planters to install them correctly, which I think affects their survival, or why we may have gotten a little bit less survival. And they were more variable and more dependent on post-planting environmental conditions than the tubuling plants were. For the tubuling stock, the nice information that we got out of this study was that the 4-inch container stock had similar survival to the 10-inch container stock. They were a little bit easier for the planters to install because they're consistent in size. They are also, though, because they have the soil with them, a lot heavier for the planters to carry in their planting bags, and so they can't carry as many plants, and you need to think about that from a logistical perspective, from them coming and going and filling up their planting bags. And then they seem to have a little bit better consistent survival and not be a little bit less dependent on the post-planting environmental conditions. The disadvantages seem to be that they're super small when they're first planted, which made monitoring really challenging for finding them on the landscape, and it took them a longer time to become reproductive and to provide that structure on the landscape that wildlife might be able to use as habitat. One of the other things after the 2000 fire that we tried, and this is just, so I'm just going to throw this out there as a little thought tickler. The areas that we planted are in the open squares, the blue and green outlines. The green polygons are areas that we did seeding, but that brown stripe was an area that we tried to do a seeding of shrub seeds and sagebrush, and it's along that same elevation that we did the plantings. And this was just to look at if we did just a seeding treatment within those same kind of environmental conditions that we were looking for. We were picking those sites that had, again, the good upland grass cover that could produce high-quality sagebrush steppe habitat if we could establish shrubs. And so this is sort of a comparison of whether or not we could establish shrubs from seed to compare it with the planting. And so we were able to determine how many seeds were actually applied in that strip. It was an aerial application, and we had sticky paper where we counted how many seeds were actually applied. So that's the seed density that was presented here on the left. So that's how many seeds were actually applied within that strip. And then the next dot on this graph is how many of those seeds germinated and emerged, and this was a sampling in various transects through that area that got seeded so that we could determine how many plants were being produced. And then in that sampling, we could not find any seedlings that actually germinated that were recruited as a sagebrush plant in the following year. So even though they germinated, they weren't able to actually grow and establish as a seedling. So I feel like that's a real bottleneck for planting or for establishing sagebrush post-fire, is the part where the seedlings are germinating and trying to establish on the landscape. And I don't know if many people saw the other webinar by Matt Germino, but it was sort of the same idea that this phase of trying to get the seed into a seedling plant is a real critical phase for sagebrush, especially Wyoming Big Sagebrush. And if you can do that part of this plant's life cycle in the nursery and then be able to put them back out on the landscape, they have a lot better chance of surviving and then eventually becoming wildlife habitat, because you're sort of taking away the most stressful time for these plants to emerge and establish. And then this is sort of just a basic thing that I did. It's not as intense as the one that we did for the paper analysis, which I'll show in the next slide. But I did sort of want to show that for a manager looking at the costs per acre, in the graph on the left of this is sort of like how much it costs per acre for these various treatments. Along the bottom, the 4-inch tubelings and the various years that we did them. The 10-inch tubelings were more expensive, they're in the yellow, than the bare root plants, and then the aerial seeding. And you can see that at least in this case, we got economy of scale by planting a large number of plants over kind of a large number of acres. It is a comparable price to doing aerial seeding. And then on the graph on the right-hand side, you can see the number of plants per acre based on our monitoring that we expect established from those plantings. And we got fairly good densities of sagebrush out there across the landscape. But it does compare well, I guess, to aerial seeding. At least in this case, we couldn't document any sagebrush establishing from our seeding, and so Just wanted to show this to give people who are land managers a chance to think about this as a viable opportunity or a viable investment in the sagebrush steppe ecosystem in those places that aren't completely infested with non-native species, and you have a component of native grass, and you can think about reintroducing the shrub component. This is something that I think is doable. This is the analysis that was done for the paper that we wrote, which is more based on the overall cost per surviving plant based on those that survived to the 3rd year of the monitoring. And in this case, you can see the higher costs were associated with the more number of amendments that were included with the plants, and then the least cost were the container plants. So this is just sort of a different way to look at the data overall, but you could potentially decide that you would want to shoot for a specific density based on cost per plant. And this eliminates the plants that it adds in the cost of plants that were planted that did not survive. So that's just another way to look at the economic, the economics of doing a project similar to this. So in conclusion, I guess what we came up with was that outplanting some of the nursery grown stock is more reliable than direct seeding as a method for restoring shrubs to the landscape, and that if you're trying to develop high quality shrub steppe habitat for wildlife, in particular sage grouse, where you would like the native understory vegetation for nesting and you'd like to have the shrub cover for foraging and nesting cover, doing this kind of project is something to consider. The other thing that we have a challenge with is in areas that are culturally sensitive or in areas where we have microbiotic crust, where we don't want to do something like drill seeding or drag chains or things like that that might break up the crust or might disturb cultural resources. Doing this kind of planting can be a management technique that can favor maintaining both cultural resources and some of these crust resources if the fire hasn't damaged that aspect of the ecosystem. And then lastly, as I showed in those last 2 slides, that the planting seedlings, depending on if you can make it a big enough project, it can have a comparable cost when compared to seeding. And also, the seedings of sagebrush seed may require more than one seeding on the same piece of ground to get some emergence of seed, just depending on the environmental conditions. And so if you need to invest in seeding over the same piece of ground more than once, I'm certain that this kind of planting could be comparable in cost to something like seeding. So this was the graph that I showed of all those various treatment conditions that we did between 2000 and 2008. I just wanted to go ahead and show that we've done, in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we do what's called adaptive management. So we take what we've learned from our management actions and then we apply them into future. And so since we have collected this data, we planted an additional 3.1 million seedlings in 25,000 acres, so it's kind of large scale, and you can see on the right-hand side, kind of the thing that we decided to do a lot of was the bare root with the hydrogel, which we had the really good survival for the lowest cost. And then we also did the ones that are whited out are the ones that were through 2008. So this is since that time, from 2007 to 2010. We focused on those treatments that we discovered were the lowest cost for the most benefit. So the majority of the acres that were planted were those bare root with hydrogel dip on the roots. And then for some areas, we chose to use the tubuling plants as sort of an insurance in case we had drought conditions, which we have experienced. And so, as you can see, we have tried to do these kind of rehabilitation treatments over these large burned areas to provide islands of wildlife habitat and islands of sagebrush that can provide seed into the future for filling in these really large burned footprints. So I guess I can say that the biggest challenge we face is trying to prevent future wildfires. We have a really active management program for maintaining our fire breaks and trying to have very rapid fire response in many cases. And again, in a lot of these plantings, we aren't focusing on areas that we have large infestations of non-native plants, or where areas have been disturbed previously and have a lot of cheatgrass in them, because planting shrubs into a cheatgrass monoculture would just put them at risk of being burned up again in a future wildfire. So I guess that's pretty much where I'm at with this particular project, but I could take questions now if anyone has any.
Great, thanks Heidi. Yeah, there are some questions. Would you mind though just leaving it up on your last slide, just in case someone...
Oh, no, I don't mind at all. Okay. Hang on.
Thanks.
Okay.
Great, thank you. All right, if you have questions for Heidi, please type them into the questions pane of your control panel. The first question is from Jeff Klausman, and he asks, do you have planting production records for this project?
So the plants were produced primarily, well, we used several different plant nurseries. Many of them came from Lucky Peak Nursery in Boise. Some of them came from private nurseries. And I would expect that they probably have those plant production records, if that's what you're talking about, from the nursery. I guess I'm not really sure what he's asking. As far as whether or not there was something done to them in the nursery that would improve their survival, I do know that a lot of the tubeling plants do get inoculated with mycorrhiza at the nursery. I don't know. Go ahead.
Jeff followed up and said, I'm referring to planting rates by type.
Yes. Rates like plants number per acre by type of plant. Yes, we do have that.
Okay, great.
No, but it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't consistent across sites or across years. So it wasn't, one of the things about doing and receiving funding from the Burned Area Emergency Rehabilitation Fund that's available to the Department of Interior and the Forest Service, is that they basically, through policy, want the funds that they provide to go to rehabilitation. They pretty much discourage putting in research plots, and so it wasn't set out to be a research project at all. And so sort of the paper that was produced was kind of a retrospective, and they tried to get as much science as they could out of the plantings that we did do, but we did not set it up in such a way that it was an experimental planting where we did equal numbers of acres of the different kinds of stock types. And that's something that I think would be really useful to do if there was a possibility to set something like that up, to take a closer look at what are the real variables that affect the various survival. We were only trying to glean as much information as we could from the management actions that we did do. So again, it wasn't set out to be a research project from the beginning, and so we were just trying to present as much as we could and do an analysis that would give us information, but it would be better to do an experimental study of that sort.
Okay, great, thank you. Nathan Darnall asks, what are the components of the hydrogel and mycorrhizal dip?
So it's a product called TerraSorb, and I believe it is similar to the kind of, it's a chemical product that it makes it's similar to, I believe, what they put in like baby diapers, but I'm not positive about that. But the idea is that it makes sort of beads. I don't know what the chemical makeup of it is, but you could look it up. It's just a product that we use called Terrasorb, and I think we got it through forestry suppliers. I know that they have a website, but anyway, the idea of that product, and I believe it's used in a lot of forestry applications, is that it will maintain moisture around the roots as the roots are establishing, and that over time it degrades in the environment, and so it's just present during that initial establishment phase, and it helps draw moisture towards the roots and maintain it there. And that's pretty much all I know about it. I didn't look into the chemistry of it or anything.
Okay, great, thank you. Nathan also asks, because precipitation appears to be a driver of plant survival, have you considered manual watering? And if so, how much water would it take? And is there a best time to water?
That's a great question. I know in some smaller plantings that have been done, in particular adjacent to us on the central Hanford portion of the landscape, where they're doing remediation after removing some contaminated soils. They've done plantings, and then they have done irrigation treatments. I think logistically it would be very difficult to do an irrigation, but if you were doing something like an old field restoration, or you had the potential to do irrigation, I really think the best time to do it would be in the early spring, late winter, early spring. And it also probably depends a little bit on what elevation you're at. We're at low elevation, so we were able to do most of our plantings in the winter in December and install them prior to our really cold weather and our snow. But if you were doing a spring planting, I think it would be really important to do it at that time. So if we planted in December and then it was cold, the plants are sort of dormant, I would wait till spring to do an irrigation. And I guess I don't think it would take that much water to get them established. I don't know, maybe an inch or an inch and a half of additional water. I don't know. I would have to look at the precipitation data and see if there was a kind of a threshold point where in years where we got less than a certain amount, we had really bad survival. That would be a good question to look into. I can't answer the question about amount, but I think timing would be in the late spring. Or late winter, early spring, sorry.
Great, thanks. Neil Hedges asks, why didn't you use 4 plants in large-scale planting?
The 4-inch plants?
Yeah, sorry.
On this map. And that's a good question, because they actually did have similar survival to the 10-inch plants. But we found that the logistics of, well, A, the logistics of doing the monitoring of them, because they're so tiny, and B, the time that it takes them to grow large enough to become habitat was sort of restricted us a little bit. The 10-inch plants have a larger top to them, and they start out a little bit bigger, so we were hopeful, and I think that it did show that those plants become, they flower and become reproductive sooner, and they can provide habitat sooner. And because we're managing primarily to try to produce wildlife habitat, it just shortens the amount of time that it takes to do that. But I think that it's totally reasonable to think about using those 4-inch tubelings. It just depends on, you know, your time frames, and I just think it would take several years longer to produce a similar sized shrub on the landscape. So that, I think, is why we chose to use the 10-inch tubelings. We didn't plant very many tubelings, as you can see, just a few in this particular location along the river, which is sort of a corridor that follows the Columbia River there. So we thought an important area to provide habitat. And also the river provides some temperature buffering in the winter, so that area stays a little bit warmer, so it's a little bit of a more priority area for wildlife down there.
Great, thank you. Larry Loftus asks, oh, I'm getting feedback from your computer, but that's okay. Okay, what kind of planting tools did the planters use?
They were just using a planting shovel that's kind of a narrow planting shovel. I think it's probably about, I don't know, 16 inches long and maybe 4 or 5 inches wide. It's just a narrow planting shovel. It's very similar to what they use for reforestation in Western Washington, planting Douglas fir trees. They've also tried to use planting bars. They basically found that the shovels worked best on our landscape because they could make a little wedge with the shovel, put the plant in there, and then just close that wedge with their boot pretty well. And they could basically do it at the pace that they would normally be walking. So they were pretty efficient about doing the planting, but that was the tools that they thought worked best.
Great, thank you.
We did have several different contractors that planted, and nearly all of them used that similar kind of planting tool.
Great. Matt Davey says, hi Heidi, great to hear from you. What's the survival of the more recent plantings looking like so far? Are you doing further monitoring?
Yeah, we've been doing further monitoring, and we've been getting pretty similar results. So if we consider if we're getting, that 25 to 30% survival, that's a pretty reasonable and successful planting. We did go to doing a little bit wider spacing of our plants, so we expanded from 10 feet to more 15 feet, but then you can see the speckling in some of these plots where we decided to put in a few smaller 1 acre or 5 acre plots of high density plantings that would benefit wildlife that like denser sage. So in that area we were looking at sage sparrows that like denser sage for nesting, or potentially we had some information about pygmy rabbit habitat over there, even though we don't have currently pygmy rabbits, but that there might be potential at some point to put them over there. And then we just went to wider spacing so that we could cover more acres, and also so that we could potentially have more resilience in the face of future fires, that the shrubs, when they grew, would be far enough apart that if one of them was on fire, it wouldn't necessarily catch its neighbors on fire. And I don't know that that would necessarily be the case, but it's sort of one of the thought processes behind it.
Great, thanks. Roger Farrell asks, what plant materials are you using in your fuel breaks? Have your fuel breaks been successful at preventing planted shrubs from burning?
The fuel breaks are just disc lines that we've used, so we're not using any plant material in them. We basically disc them once in the spring and then once a little bit later to kind of keep them as bare ground. And yes, their primary ignition sources through this area, there's several highways and roadways, and so the fire breaks go along the roadways, and they've really prevented a lot of fires. I don't have the number, although my fire management officer is actually at a meeting this week, and he took a poster that has that information. I could get it to you if you wanted, but there was a significant number of fires each year prevented from the roadways for sure. The large fire that we had last year was lightning caused, so those are the ones that are more difficult, of course, to prevent because it's difficult to predict where those ignitions are going to take place. So.
Great, thanks. Richard Easterly asks, how much natural reproduction have you seen?
Oh yeah, hi Richard. We have seen that also be the case, in particular in years where there is some good precipitation, one fire in particular is 2007 fire in an area where we had a dense stand of sage that burned off. We did do some replanting in there, but we did also have a lot of volunteer sagebrush plants that were recorded within our monitoring plots. And so I think in a really important aspect of doing this work is when we do our burn area emergency response, doing a really good assessment of the fire damage in areas that are severely burned versus areas where the fire may have moved more quickly and not had as long of residence time and maybe was a little bit less severe. In some of those areas where there were shrubs prior to the fire, there can be the opportunity to have some natural regeneration from seed, but again, depends a little bit on the environmental conditions in, I would say, probably the first year following the fire on whether or not the seed would naturally regenerate. But we have documented that taking place as well.
Great, thank you. That looks like the last question. Thank you all for your participation. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey of this webinar that will appear after the webinar has ended. I will post the recording of this webinar on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel this afternoon, and the link will be automatically sent to you through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow. Our next webinar, Insects Affecting Native Seed Production with Bob Hammond from the Tri-River Area Extension in Colorado, will take place on Thursday, this Thursday, the 24th. If you have further questions regarding this webinar or have requests for future webinars, please email or call me anytime. Again, thank you for your participation today, and thank you, Heidi, for your presentation. All right, have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Jeannie. Hey, Jeannie, do you need me to do anything or send you this PowerPoint, or will you?
Oh, that would be great.
How does that work?
Send me the PowerPoint.
Well, how does that work? How are you going to post it? I guess I'm curious about how that works. So you could talk, I could call you later if you want.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks.